A horror story to sleep. The shadow of the night. In a remote village on the edge of the mountains, where only the roar of cold winds and the creak of ancient trees arrived, very few people lived in complete isolation from the outside world. The small village called Shadows was famous for its mysterious tales of ghosts and nocturnal creatures emerging from the depths of the dense forests surrounding it. One day, a young man named Marwan arrived in the village, who had left the city in search of comfort and tranquility away from the noise of civilian life. Marwan was hearing about the village of Shadows from his friends, and decided to test whether these stories were true or just myths told by the people of the neighboring villages. Upon his arrival in the village, a resident advised him to stay away from the forest at night and not to go to the so-called deserted shelter on the top of the mountain. The sun was setting on the horizon when Marwan arrived in the village. The sky was turning dark red, as if saying goodbye to the day, to receive the lonely darkness. Marwan didn't heed too much of the warnings. All he wanted was to relax away from the stresses of life. He decided to live in an old house on the outskirts of the village, which was once the home of a family elder. But from the first night, he began to feel something strange. Every time he closed his eyes to fall asleep, he could hear weak whispers coming from the dark corners of the room. Incomprehensible whispers, as if coming from the depths of the earth itself. There was no one in the room, but the sound was getting closer and closer, as if something was creeping towards him in the dark. The next day, Marwan went to talk to a villager about these strange sounds, but found that everyone was evading talking about them. Faces quickly turned into cautious glances, and at times, some whispered words that seemed incomplete, as if they were afraid of something. As the days passed, Marwan began to discover some dark secrets about that village. The villagers always said that darkness was not just the absence of light, but the existence of something else, something that was never told about. They believed that evil creatures inhabited the forest surrounding the village, and that these creatures usually attacked those who broke the ancient laws imposed by the ancestors. One of the old elders in the village told him about the abandoned shelter on top of the mountain. The sheik said, "This place is the epicenter of evil. Whoever goes there does not return, or comes back with his soul changed to something else." These words were more than enough to arouse Marwan's curiosity, but also planted a seed of fear in them. One night, Marwan decided to discover for himself the truth behind this place. As darkness fell, he took his dim lamp and began walking towards the mountain. The trees were swaying strangely under the high winds, as if watching his steps. On the way to the mountain, he passed through some abandoned houses that emitted unpleasant odors, his eyes picking up moving shadows in the limbs. Marwan finally reached the top of the mountain where he was the abandoned refuge. The place was very desolate, and the old building seems to have once been a place to live, but now it is ruined and abandoned, covered in dirt and mold. He felt something strange hovering in the air around him, and he was getting more nervous as he got closer. As he stepped into the building, a sudden rattle sounded from inside the walls, as if something was crawling behind it. Marwan stopped in place and listened carefully, but could only hear his quick breath. He decided to enter the main room of the building, where it was completely dark, and nothing but deafening silence. As he fumbled inside, he felt something sticky on the floor. When the lamp lit up on the floor, he discovered that it was stains of dry blood stained the floor. He felt something heavy in the air, as if the walls themselves were breathing. As he stepped back, he felt something suddenly touching his hand. He looked quickly and found nothing, but there was something strange coming out of the walls, an inconspicuous shadow, like imagination dancing on the edge of vision. Before he could escape, he fainted and fell to the ground, closing his eyes. When he woke up, he found himself in a completely strange place. His body felt heavy, as if something had stuck to him. When he opened his eyes, he discovered that he was no longer in the abandoned shelter, but in a dark place with nothing bounded by anything. It was surrounded by tall and dark trees, and the sky was swimming in a sea of blackness. Suddenly, dark objects emerged, as if they were emerging from the earth itself. The shadow was moving in front of him, moving like clouds, but with red eyes shining in the dark. These creatures mumbled words he couldn't understand, but they were repeating one thing over and over: "He's a part of us now." Thus, when he woke up from his coma, he was in place exactly as he was, but his mind was lost, and his memory became blurry. Marwan was no longer the same, and the nocturnal creatures that inhabited the forest had taken his soul forever. Since then, Marwan's soul is said to still wander in the shadows, looking for someone else to lose his soul in this miserable place. Whenever darkness falls, the village remembers that story that began to inhabit the mountains, and everyone waits with horror for the return of those spirits. But no one dares to approach the mountain, not even to talk about this abandoned refuge, because they know very well that darkness has its power. Shadow of the Night, Part 2. Several months have passed since Marwan's disappearance, but the small village of Shadows has not been able to get rid of the traces of this mysterious tale. Despite everyone's warnings, strangers who hear about the story began to flock to the village, trying to discover the truth behind those shadows that roam the mountains at night. Rumors were growing, and people began to talk in a low voice about the darkness that crept into human souls. Meanwhile, a strange man named Ibrahim arrived in the village. He was middle-aged, looking dignified, but his eyes were carrying a strange intensity, as if they were seeing beyond the barriers. Ibrahim heard about the shadow of the night, and decided to go to the village to unravel the secrets of this cursed place. He had read about Marwan and his disappearance, and wanted to be the one to unravel this dark mystery. However, he did not realize that his fate was linked to more power than curiosity. On his first night in the village, Ibrahim sat in the small village bar chatting with its people, who were smiling at him at first, but their gaze became more cautious as he asked more questions about the abandoned shelter. As with Marwan, everyone started to avoid talking about this place, and some were whispering incomprehensible words, turning their eyes as if they were afraid to mention it out loud. The next morning, Ibrahim visited the old sheik who was telling stories about the darkness. He thought he might gain some wisdom from him. The sheik, who was sitting under an old tree, looked at him deeply and said, "You will not get out of this place unscathed, unless you understand the reality of what is happening here. The shadows leave no one." Ibrahim, although he had doubts about the veracity of what he heard, felt something strange in his heart. He decides that he will follow in Marwan's footsteps, and will discover whether these myths are myths or dark truths waiting to be approached. As night fell, in his quiet way, Ibrahim embarked on a journey to the mountain. The moon was illuminating the sky, but its light was blurry as if covered by thick clouds, making the road to the mountain more isolated. The cold winds crept through the trees, and as he approached the top of the mountain, he felt something heavy in the air, as if something was watching him. When he arrived at the abandoned shelter, the building was more miserable than he imagined. Its walls were cracked, and the iron door was broken, as if someone had tried to enter it in the past but was blocked. Step by step, Ibrahim went inside, and each time he felt something strange creeping through the air around him. Faint whispers, things moving in the dark. The lamp was on, but the light was very dim, and he was confronted with shadows moving in an illogical way, as if watching his movements. When he crossed into the main room, he felt something urging him to stop, as if the same place was asking him to retreat. He paused, then started taking pictures inside the room with his old cameras, but what he saw was unbelievable. In one corner, an old photograph of Marwan appeared, but the image was distorted, as if it was constantly changing. Marwan's features in the photo were fading and reappearing in an inhuman form, resembling tangled shadows. Ibrahim felt something heavy on his chest, as if cold air had swept through the place, and when he looked around, he discovered that the walls were beginning to breathe. The walls were swelling and contracting as if they were a living organism, breathing slowly and making incomprehensible sounds. At that moment, the ground under his feet began to crack, and a dark creature appeared in front of him, resembling a shadow wrapped around himself. His head was low and his eyes red. An ray of weak light crept into his eyes, and he felt great pain. "It's getting late," the object whispered in a strange voice, as if the same words were flowing from the depths of darkness. "I told you, nobody gets out of here." Ibrahim, despite his fear, decided to run, so he ran fast in the dark corridors of the building, but felt that there was an invisible hand chasing him. The moment he approached the exit door, his feet slipped on the slippery ground, and he fell into a deep hole. His eyes widened sharply with horror, and his mind was unable to comprehend what was happening. But at that moment, he saw something unbelievable. There were Marwan's features, but they were distorted, non-human. He was waving to him in the dark, in that dark hole, and the smile on his face was unnatural, like a dead smile. At that moment, Abraham felt something creep into his mind, as if he had been possessed by the dark spirits, and that he was no longer just a human being, but had become part of that shadow. Ibrahim woke up to the sound of a confused light in his ear, and when he opened his eyes, he found himself lying in the same place where he started, but with something different. His eyes were full of tears, and his mind was confused. When he tried to get out of the room, he discovered that he was no longer in the same place, but in something like a other reality, where there was nothing but darkness. His hands moved abnormally, as if they had their own will. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he discovered that he was no longer himself, but had become another shadow, and when he raised his head, he saw thousands of eyes watching him, each whispering in one voice, "He is now a part of us." At the same moment, darkness again engulfed the village, and no one heard of Abraham after that night. As time passed, the silence in the village increased, and people began to feel something heavy in the air. It was that whispering voice, a voice that gets closer and closer to everyone in the village, reminding them of what happens to those who dare to approach the shadows of the mountains. We will talk about the second story. Part 1. Access to the abandoned town. On a sunny morning in 1820, Detective Edward Cole was watching the horizon from the window of the train car that was traveling across the vast western plains. The journey was long, and the feelings in his heart were stronger than ever. All the evidence he has gathered in recent years has pointed to a small, deserted town called Williamsville, where everyone who inhabited it mysteriously disappeared. "Alan, we're close," the interrogator said as he turned to the doctor sitting in front of him. Alan Howell was a middle-aged man, with a thick beard and bright eyes with intelligence. He always sought to solve medical mysteries, and today he has accompanied the detective on this journey, hoping to uncover the truth about what is happening in Williamsville. The children, Mary and Jim, were sitting in the other corner, looking out at the dusty road and rugged mountains. They had lost their parents in a strange accident in the same town, and they hoped that this journey would be the beginning of the end of their suffering. "Edward, do you really think there's something strange here?" Dr. Howell asked curiously. "I think there's something horrible about this town, Alan. Its residents suddenly disappeared, and no one knows why. But I'm sure the answers are here." They finally reached the abandoned entrance to the town. The roads were dusty and the buildings were demolished, as if time had stopped here decades ago. Williamsville seemed to slowly wither, leaving behind traces of deep sadness that time could no longer heal. As they entered the town, The atmosphere began to get heavier. The wind was blowing through the trees, and strange voices were whispering on the horizon. Suddenly, they all felt like they were watching from a distance. At that moment, Edward felt a trembling in his heart, as if something was in store for them. "Let's pay close attention. There's something abnormal in this place," the interrogator said as he turned to the children. Everyone was nervous, but decided to move on, determined to uncover the secrets of the abandoned town. This is a strong start to your story, and you can continue to build the story in the same style, focusing on the mysterious atmosphere and the accelerating events that gradually reveal the sad curse that hangs over the town. Part 2. Inside the town. The wind was blowing through abandoned buildings, as if trying to tell them something they couldn't understand. Edward was moving forward confidently, while Alan checked through some old medical notes he found in his bag. Mary and Jim walked behind them, their eyes moving between the abandoned places cautiously. They have reached what appears to be the main town square. Dilapidated houses, closed doors for years. There were old footprints on the ground, as if someone had just passed by. But there was no one now. This place looks like it was teeming with life, and then suddenly it's deserted like it's forgotten in time, Edward said as he looked around. "I can't believe this town was full of people one day," Alan added, picking up some papers scattered on the ground. "Maybe there was a tragedy. Or maybe something else." They decided to head to one of the houses that still had signs of surprise on its walls. When Edward pushed the dilapidated door, they were all shocked by what they saw, a dark room full of dust, but on the walls there were strange drawings. Photos of families from the past, but there was something distorted in the faces, something unnatural. "Look." "Mary," said Mary, referring to one photo showing a pregnant woman with a harsh look on her face, her eyes full of despair. "This picture looks like... strange. It's like this woman knows something, as if she was feeling something horrible about to happen," Edward said. While examining the photo closely, the interrogator caught a handwritten note on the wall near the photo. The words were confusing, but it was clearly a prayer or ritual of sorts. "The curse will not end until justice is overturned. The shadows will remain until the right returns to its place." "What is it?" Dr. Allen wondered as he read the words aloud. "Is it part of the local myth? There seems to be something more than just the disappearance of my population here. This town may be doomed to a curse from which no one can escape," Edward said in a quiet voice. Chapter 3. Secrets of the Past. That night, as they settled in one of the abandoned rooms in town, everyone felt something strange surrounding them. High winds were coming from the nearby mountains, and the sound was like distant moaning sounds, bringing back painful memories. In the middle of the night, Jim woke up suddenly. He could hear light whispers coming from outside. He pushed Mary beside him and whispered, "Do you hear that? I think there's someone here." "Outside," Mary said in a tense tone. They cautiously walked out of the room, sneaking through the narrow corridors. As they approached a deserted window, they saw something horrible, a dark shadow moving between the trees outside. The figure resembled a person, but his eyes were devoid of life, and their bodies were inexplicably distorted. "Edward," Alan whispered in a trembling voice, running quickly toward them. "Do you see that?" Edward said as he watched the shadow move slowly. "These are the ghosts that the memoirs talked about. It's the town's families who died, but never left here." But at that moment, the shadows suddenly disappeared among the trees. The atmosphere was fraught with fear, and each of them felt something strange, as if something was watching them all the time. It seems that the curse is not just a myth. It's a fact. These shadows are the souls of the families who died here, and they don't want to leave this place so they can solve what happened to them. Chapter 4. The Shadows That Return. The next day, Edward and Alan decided to return to the area that housed the forest near town. There, the answer to the dark mystery awaited them. As they prepared to go, Mary and Jim told them about seeing a stranger one day ago, someone who looked very strange, with deep sadness in their eyes. The children thought this person was part of the curse. If it was the person the children saw who caused this curse, we must confront him, Edward said confidently. They headed to the forest, where the trees began to move as if to hide something. As they approached the center of the forest, they felt something heavy in the air, something invisible but felt it around every corner. Finally, they arrived at the place where the incident was said to have occurred. There was an ancient tomb, with ancient inscriptions representing the family of the victims of the horrific accident. But at that moment, they felt something strange. There was no one, but the shadows were chasing them, getting closer and closer. Then the voice began to be heard. The suffering will not end until the souls are washed away from sadness. Chapter 5. The Painful End. Edward and Alan came to the painful truth. The accident was the result of the anger of a pregnant woman who was killed by betrayal from a close person. The curse, which began years ago, was linked to her deep grief and unfinished pain. It was the man who caused her death who was behind the curse, but he disappeared years ago. In the last moments, he confronted them, but they were also faced with unbearable sadness. The curse is destroyed, but the deep sadness will haunt them all forever. It's all over now, but we'll never forget what we've experienced here, Edward said sadly as he looked at the children. In an instant, they left the town, but the shadows remained, as if watching them from afar, bringing with them the endless sadness. Chapter 6. Return to the Shadows. After leaving town, Edward and his companions thought it was all over. But the journey to the dark past was far from over. Although the curse was broken, the lingering memories left deeper wounds than they could have imagined. The path to the unknown. When they arrived in the neighboring city, Westerhaven, they decided to stay for a night before continuing their journey to the capital. Westerhaven seemed more alive, but something mysterious was hiding in its dark corners. The children were exhausted, but Edward and Alan were overwhelmed with thought. Edward, I can't stop thinking about those shadows. It's like it's never gone away, said Alan in a voice weighed down with anxiety. I know what you mean. I feel like we never left. It's like something has followed us here, the interrogator responded in a cautious tone. Dark dreams. That night, Jim saw a strange dream. He found himself in the cursed forest, where he heard the voice of the pregnant woman, crying and screaming in the dark. She used to say, "The truth hasn't been revealed all." He woke up panting and found Mary crying beside him unknowingly. "Have you seen the same dream?" he asked, trembling. She shook her head nervously and said, "They're here. They never went." References from the past. The next morning, while inspecting the hostel, Edward found a mysterious letter placed on the table, written in old ink. What started at Williamsville is not over. He who betrayed souls still roams free, and sadness will not pass away until justice is served. The interrogator felt chills running through his body. No one knew their story in this town. How can this be possible? New inquiry. They decided to return to Williamsville despite the risks. The town was waiting for them as if it knew they would return. This time, it wasn't as deserted as it was. The town seemed to have regained part of its old life, but the spirits are still stuck in their dark places. They arrived at an old building that was known as the home of former Mayor Jonathan Gray, the man who was the last to be seen alive in the town before the residents disappeared. The house was cracked, but still standing, as if refusing to fall. Uncovering the truth. Inside, they found a library full of old books and memoirs. One of the books contained harrowing details about the town's past. Jonathan Gray knew about the curse, but he thought he could deceive death by sacrificing an innocent soul. But things did not go as planned. The betrayal was deeper than he could have imagined. Edward realized that the mayor was not innocent, and that he was probably the real reason behind what happened in Williamsville. Final showdown. As they examined the library, they heard footsteps coming from the dark corridors. There was a figure peeking out of the darkness. An old man with a pale face and eyes full of sadness and anger. "You're back. I knew you would come back," he said in a soothing voice. "Are you Jonathan Gray?" asked Edward as he cautiously raised his gun. The man laughed a dry laugh and said, "I'm what's left of it, and what is left of the curse that will never go away." Shadows rushed everywhere, as if trying to wipe out the last vestiges of life in town. They realized that the only solution was to face the whole truth, and to acknowledge the betrayal that had occurred years ago. Tragic conclusion. At the last minute, Edward and his companions confronted the angry spirits, and Gray confessed his guilt and crimes in front of everyone. But the confession was not enough. The shadows were looking for something else, justice that was not served. Before their eyes, the mayor collapsed and fell, only to be swallowed up by the ground as if to finally take revenge on him. With him, the town slowly began to disappear, as if its existence was linked to his curse. When the sun finally rose, there was no sign of town or shadows. They stood in the quiet void, carrying with them memories that could never be erased. The end, or the beginning. They thought everything was over, but on the distant horizon there was a shadow watching them silently, carrying with it the promise that evil could not be easily eradicated, that the past never died. Rather, it lurks in the shadows. Chapter 1. The Anonymous Call. Sammer was a man accustomed to loneliness. He lives in an old wooden hut located on the edge of the Black Mirror Forest. The forest was famous for its frightening legends and stories that talk about angry spirits and strange sounds that appear on dark nights. One night, while Sammer sat by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth of the dancing fire, he heard a faint call coming from the forest. The words were confused, but the sound carried a mixture of despair and sadness. He hesitantly stood at the door, contemplating the thick darkness. The call was repeated in a sad tone, as if someone was calling for help. He picked up his old lamp and went out towards the source of the sound. Chapter 2. Depths of Darkness. Sammer took cautious steps into the forest, where trees were tangled as if to prevent light from creeping in. The deeper it gets, the clearer the sound becomes, and the more distress. He stopped abruptly when he spotted a shadow moving through the trees, but when he pointed the light of the lamp at him, he found nothing. Hallucinations because of loneliness, he wondered to himself, but something inside him pushed him forward. He reached a small lake in the middle of the forest, the waters of which were black as ink, reflected by the stars of the distant sky. Next to the lake, he saw something strange, an old mirror partially broken, and its frame decorated with strange carvings. When he approached her, He saw in her reflection the face of a pale woman with empty eyes. Before he could comprehend what he saw, the image suddenly disappeared. Chapter 3: Buried Secrets. Samar felt chills running through his body. He quickly turned around to leave, but found that the path he came from had completely disappeared. Instead, a new road appeared in front of him, covered with rotting leaves. He began walking on the road, his eyes watching every strange movement around him. At the end of the path, an old abandoned house appears, with shattered doors and windows, and walls covered with twisted black chrome. As he approached the front door, he opened with an annoying squeaking sound, as if inviting him in. Samar entered cautiously, with a lamp in his hand, trembling with each step. Chapter 4: Trapped Souls. The rooms were dark and damp, smelling of mold. He found an old table with a tightly closed wooden box on it. When he opened it, he found inside it a collection of old letters written in pale red ink. He began to read in a trembling voice. To those who read these letters, "We have been trapped here for many years. The forest captures souls, and they are inevitable. If you've arrived here, know you're being watched. Escape is impossible." Before he could finish reading the second letter, the lamp suddenly went out, and the room was covered in total darkness. Chapter 5: The Terrifying Confrontation. Samar began to feel something moving around him in the dark. Slow footsteps approaching him, and confused whispers filled the corner. He quickly lit a match, and saw the face of the pale woman he saw in the mirror standing steps away from him, her eyes shining with foul glitter. "Why did you come here?" she whispered in a horrible voice. Samar retreated in horror, trying to escape, but stumbled and fell to the ground. The shadows were slowly approaching him, and the voices were getting louder. Chapter 6: The Shocking Truth. When he opened his eyes, he found himself lying by the black lake, as if what had happened was a nightmare. But he realized the truth when he found the old letters in his pocket. Before he could gather strength, he saw his face reflected in the waters of the lake, but he was not alone. The pale woman stood behind him, smiling coldly. She whispered to him softly, "Now you are one of us. The forest is inevitable." The voices of calls rose again in the forest, looking for a new victim lost. And so the never-ending curse continued. Chapter 7: The Last Call. The forest has become a haven for confused souls who cannot find a way out. As for Samar, his call has become one of the sad voices asking for help.